Fear is not a choice. It is the price of belief. But what happens when fear is not enough? Across history, people didn't just fear the gods' wrath. They feared their silence. To be abandoned by the gods was a fate worse than death. Without their favour, the rains did not come. The crops failed. The enemy armies invaded. When the gods turned away, so did the world itself. This is Pantheon mythology, and today we do not ask whether the gods should be feared. We acknowledge that they must be. If you too want to be acknowledged, check out Pantheon Apparel, our clothing brand inspired by myths, folklore and legend. We ship worldwide and are rated excellent on Trustpilot. Link in the description. Fear was never just a byproduct of religion. It was its foundation. The earliest gods were not loving, merciful beings. They were rulers, executioners, and cosmic enforcers. Their favor meant survival. Their anger meant ruin. Ancient myths weren't bedtime stories. They were warnings. The wrath of Zeus was not a fable. It was a reminder that kings who defied the gods would be crushed. The flood in the book of Genesis was not a metaphor, but a declaration that all of humanity could be erased in a single act of judgment. The Egyptian afterlife was not a place of rest, but a treacherous realm where the soul was weighed, and a single misstep could lead to annihilation. But the gods didn't just punish, they controlled. Taboos were their commandments, and breaking them was a direct challenge to their authority. In ancient Greece, the greatest sin was hubris, the arrogance of believing oneself equal to the gods. Prometheus stole fire and was bound for eternity. Niobe mocked the goddess Leto and watched her children slaughtered. To overstep one's place was to invite destruction. In Polynesian cultures, kapu laws dictated every aspect of life. Certain foods, places, and even shadows were forbidden. To violate a kapu was to risk a famine, plague, or war. These laws were enforced not just by rulers, but by the gods themselves. If disaster struck, it was because someone had broken the sacred order. Mesopotamian kings ruled by sacred right, enforcing brutal justice in the name of the gods. Punishments were absolute. An eye for an eye, a life for a life. Not because of human law, but because balance demanded it. Even in Norse belief, where warriors embraced death, oaths were sacred. To break an oath was not just dishonorable, it was an offense against Odin himself, one that could lead to an afterlife of suffering. Loki, the trickster, was bound beneath the earth, his punishment a warning that even the cleverest could not escape wrath. To the ancients, fear was not weakness. It was the only rational response to a world ruled by gods who did not tolerate defiance. Fear was control, and control meant survival. But fear alone wasn't enough. It had to be managed, manipulated, and fed. Priests did not just interpret the will of the gods, they dictated how the fear was expressed. Through ritual and sacrifice, people believed they could buy favor from forces beyond their control. The Aztecs offered human hearts to the sun, believing that without blood, the world would end. In ancient China, elaborate ancestor rites were performed to avoid ghostly retribution, reinforcing the idea that neglecting the dead could bring disaster upon the living. Ritual was more than tradition. It was psychological conditioning. Fear was transformed into action, giving form through offerings, prayers, and ceremonies. The faithful did not just fear punishment. They feared what would happen if they failed to perform rituals exactly as prescribed. In ancient Rome, augurs interpreted the flights of birds, determining whether the gods approved of a course of action. The belief that the gods communicated through signs and demanded practice rituals gave priests immense power over rulers and the people alike. But in reality, the gods have no guarantees. The rains still failed. The plagues still came. The sacrifices continued, yet disasters struck without mercy. When rituals failed, the fear deepened. Had the offering been insufficient? Had a hidden transgression angered the gods? Had the priests deceived them? Or worse, were the gods themselves deceptive? This led to an even darker fear, not just of punishment, but of uncertainty. If the gods could not be trusted, then fear itself became a weapon, wielded by those who claimed to speak for them. Perhaps worse than wrath is indifference. A god that punishes at least acknowledges you. But what of the gods that do not? What of the forces that exist beyond judgment, beyond morality, beyond the very idea of caring? For most of history, the gods were believed to shape the world, dictate fortune and fate. But what if the world was not shaped at all? What if forces that ruled existence had no will, no purpose, no interest in the prayers of mortals? This was a terror far greater than punishment, the realization that there is no divine order, that the universe itself is indifferent. Ancient civilizations looked upon the forces of nature and saw gods, yet even their worship betrayed an underlying fear. The storms, the plagues, the floods, the earthquakes, were these truly acts of judgment, or simply the blind movements of an uncaring cosmos? It is no coincidence that many of the oldest gods were not kings or warriors, but faceless, formless things. Storms, rivers, the sky itself. To call them gods was to impose meaning upon them, to make them something that could be reasoned with. But the fear always remained. What if they could not be reasoned with? What if they did not listen? This fear shaped some of the oldest myths. In Egypt, Apophis was not a god of justice, nor a ruler of the underworld. He was simply the darkness that sought to swallow the sun. Every night, he rose from the depths of the underworld to consume the light, and every night, the gods fought to drive him back. There was no defeating him, no bargaining with him. He had no temple, no priests, no worshippers. He was chaos given form, an eternal threat that could never be reasoned with, only delayed. And that fear has never left us. The gods of the modern age may not sit atop thrones of gold, but they remain in our stories. Lovecraftian horrors, rogue artificial intelligences, unknowable beings that drift through the cosmos, these are not gods that punish, because to punish is to acknowledge. They are gods that do nothing. And in that silence, we see the abyss. No matter how many prayers are whispered, no matter how many sacrifices are made, the gods will never listen. As humanity moved from polytheism to monotheism, divine fear did not fade. It changed. A pantheon was unpredictable, but at least it was divided. One god could be angered, but another could grant favour. A cruel god could be balanced by a merciful one. But with the rise of monotheism, that balance was gone. There was only one God, and his will was absolute. This God did not rule alongside others. He had no rivals, no equals, no opposition. There was no refuge, no second God to seek protection from. He was everywhere, always watching. He did not need temples to see you. He did not need priests to hear you, did not need statues to hold his presence. His eyes were in your thoughts. His judgment already passed before you even spoke your sins. Polytheistic faiths had their own ideas of judgment, of underworlds and paradise. In ancient Egypt, The Book of the Dead describes how the heart of the deceased was weighed against a feather of Ma'at. If it was too heavy with sin, it was devoured by Amit, and the soul was annihilated. But if it passed, the soul could live forever in the field of reeds. In Greek mythology, Hesiod's works describe Tartarus, where the wicked were punished, but also Elysium, where heroes and the righteous could dwell in peace. These were destinations, places one could reach. They had rulers, judges, and even paths to escape or atone. Even in the darkest underworlds, there were shades of mercy, a hierarchy, a structure that could be understood. But an omnipotent God did not rule over an underworld. He ruled over eternity itself. The God of Abrahamic monotheism was not a cosmic administrator, weighing deeds like Osiris or Minos. He was judge, jury, and executioner in one, with no room for bargains, no chance of escape. Daniel 12:2 speaks of a resurrection to everlasting life or everlasting contempt, and in Matthew 25:46, Jesus describes a final separation, eternal life or eternal punishment. The gods of the past could be fled from. A trickster might outwit them, a hero might challenge them, a priest might appease them. But there was no outwitting, no challenging, no appeasing a God who already knew your fate before you were even born. Romans 9:15 states, "I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion." No sacrifice could change his mind. No ritual could manipulate his favor. His mortality was unknowable, his will beyond question. And his punishment was not a place to endure. It was a trial to pass through. It was forever. To live was to be judged. To die was to face the sentence. And that sentence had no end. The fear of the gods did not lessen. It became total. If gods were to be feared, what of the things even they despised? Many religions introduced demonic figures not just as villains, but as necessary reinforcements of fear. The gods may punish, but demons corrupt. The gods demand obedience, but demons offer temptation. The gods may bring suffering, but demons bring something far worse: despair. The fear of gods was never just about their power, it was about protection. The gods ruled through punishment, but they also held back the horrors that lurked beyond the edges of order. To stray from them was not just defiance, it was to remove the last barrier between oneself and something far worse. Christianity has Satan not merely as an adversary, but as a cautionary tale. His rebellion was not just a challenge to God. It was a warning to all who would question authority. To disobey was not only to invite punishment, but to risk eternal separation, to fall beyond the reach of salvation. In Zoroastrianism, Anga Mainyu opposes Ahura Mazda, not as a rival deity, but as a force of unmaking, a being whose very essence is deception and destruction. Even in polytheistic traditions, demons existed as forces of chaos that justified submission to the gods. In Hinduism, the Asuras waged war against the Devas, a battle that was never truly won, only delayed. Rakshasas, night-stalking flesh-eaters, thrived in the darkness, preying on those who strayed too far from righteousness. In Japanese mythology, Oni are monstrous spirits, often depicted as malevolent ogres or demons that punish the wicked. While some stories describe them as former humans transformed by their own sins, others present them as entities of pure chaos, existing beyond human morality. The gods were not just feared for their own wrath. They were feared because without them, there was nothing standing between humanity and the abyss. This fear was not just about punishment, it was about survival. The gods were cruel, but cruelty was preferable to chaos. Their justice was harsh, but it was better than nothing at all. They held the order of the world together, and to turn from them was to risk tearing it apart. Because if you do not fear the gods, something far worse may come instead. Religion did not just govern laws, it shaped morality itself. The idea of punishment from the gods was not limited to the physical world. It reached into the mind, shaping thoughts, emotions, and instincts. Sins had consequences, not just in life, but beyond it. Guilt and shame became internalized fear, so deeply ingrained that even in the absence of punishment, people policed themselves. This fear was not just about avoiding suffering, it was about control. Those who obeyed were promised rewards. Those who disobeyed were cast out, condemned, or left to suffer in this life or the next. But what is obedience if there is no choice? What is virtue if it is driven by terror? Many ancient laws reinforced this control. In medieval Christianity, the fear of hell shaped every aspect of life. The concept of original sin meant that no one was truly good on their own. Confession, penance, and devotion were not just about moral improvement, they were acts of self-preservation. Fear ensured that even those who never committed a crime still sought redemption. Beyond the Abrahamic world, religious fear shaped behavior just as deeply. In ancient China, Confucian ideals merged with religious thought, emphasizing strict obedience to authority and ritual purity. To disobey one's elders was not just dishonorable, it was a disruption of the cosmic balance. In Hinduism, the doctrine of karma ensured that mortal behavior was not just encouraged, but enforced across lifetimes. Every action carried unseen consequences, creating an ever-present fear that one's own past would dictate their suffering. Fear did not create mortality, but it dictated its terms. A person might avoid stealing because they believe it is wrong. They might also avoid it because they fear punishment. But when morality is defined by the gods, when right and wrong are dictated rather than understood, where does that leave free will? Did the gods shape morality, or did they simply create obedience? Fear shaped societies, but it also created contradictions. The most pious were often the most afraid. The most devoted lived in a state of constant scrutiny, not just from their gods, but from their own thoughts. Was every action worthy? Was every word acceptable? Could they ever truly be good enough? What happens when morality is no longer an internal compass, but an external command? And if morality is driven by fear, does it have meaning? Or is it simply the price of survival? We like to believe we have moved past ancient fear, that we are no longer afraid of lightning strikes from Zeus or the anger of the gods. But fear of higher powers never left. It only changed. Today, religious institutions still use fear, not of a vengeful storm god, but of eternal suffering. Hellfire sermons paint visions of endless torment. Preachers warn that questioning belief itself invites catastrophe. Even in societies that have distanced themselves from organized religion, the remnants remain. Guilt, shame, and the fear of condemnation are woven into culture, passed down through generations. The idea that suffering is deserved, that misfortune is punishment, still lingers in the collective mind. Cults operate on the same foundation that once made gods feared. They isolate, they control, they create forbidden knowledge that must not be questioned. Leaders present themselves as chosen figures, their world beyond challenge. Doubt is punished, obedience is rewarded. The faithful are kept in line not by choice, but by fear of what awaits those who leave. These methods are not relics of history. They are still used today. Even outside of religion, fear remains a tool of control. Political leaders invoke acts of God to explain disasters, turning human suffering into something inevitable. Insurance companies use the term to absolve themselves of responsibility. Entire nations are told that their hardships are the result of moral failure, not misfortune. In modern narratives, punishment no longer comes from God striking down the wicked, but from an unseen judgment that operates in the background, ensuring that no action is ever free from consequence. Fear of higher powers has never disappeared. It has simply evolved, adapting to new names, new institutions, new ways of ensuring obedience. The gods still demand fear, and humanity still gives it to them.
The gods are not distant rulers sitting upon golden thrones. They are here. They are the floods that swallow kingdoms, the fires that turn cities to ash, the sickness that festers in the blood of the innocent. They are the shifting earth, the endless void, the whisper in the dark that promises nothing but oblivion. They do not ask for devotion. They do not need our prayers. They do not bargain. They do not plead. They do not wait. We do not fear them out of ignorance. We fear them because we are weak. We fear them because they are inevitable. But no matter how much we build, no matter how far we run, they will always be there, watching, waiting, reminding us that we are nothing in their path. And that is why we fear them. Because we must.